The Galactic King paced nervously in his throne room, his mind consumed by a plan that had taken weeks to carefully craft. He had been the undisputed ruler of the galaxy for decades, commanding fleets of warships and amassing untold riches. But there was one thing he had never been able to control: diplomacy. The universe's political landscape was unpredictable, and the recent arrival of the Diplomat from the distant Federation had only made the king's grip feel weaker. Her name was Asha, and she was sent as a messenger to negotiate a treaty that the king found unacceptable. Her presence was a reminder of his vulnerability, a symbol of everything he despised: weakness, compromise, and the belief that his power could ever be challenged. Asha was no ordinary diplomat. She was calm, composed, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had been around long enough to know that power didn't always have to be flaunted. The king could see it in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of him. That defiance, that calm arrogance, angered him more than anything else. No one ever dared to question his authority, but here was this woman, a stranger to his palace, who dared to walk in, speak to him like they were equals, and propose terms that would force him to relinquish his dominance. It was a blow to his pride that he simply could not bear. The king had spent countless hours in private meetings with his closest advisors, going over every possible scenario. They had discussed the Federation's growing power, the threat Asha represented, and what needed to be done to neutralize her. But the more the king thought about it, the clearer it became. There was no negotiating with someone like her. She wouldn't back down. She wouldn't show fear. And so, the king decided that there was only one way to end this threat once and for all. His plan was simple, almost too simple. He would have her eliminated before she could ever leave his palace. His spies had informed him of her whereabouts, and the moment she left his chambers after their final meeting, he would strike. The king had made a deal with the palace guards, a small team of the most skilled assassins who would move quickly, quietly, and without hesitation. The king knew his guards could handle it. They would ensure that Asha was never heard from again. What the king didn't know, however, was that his confidence in the palace guards was his first mistake. They weren't just dealing with a diplomat. They were dealing with a force that none of them could have ever anticipated. The king had read stories of ancient beings, entities that existed outside the realm of his understanding. He had heard whispers about Baba Yaga, the mythical figure whose name struck fear in the hearts of even the bravest soldiers. Legends told of her supernatural abilities and the destruction she could bring with just a flick of her wrist. But those were just stories, weren't they? Folklore passed down through the centuries. He had dismissed them as fanciful tales, not meant to be taken seriously. What he didn't realize was that Asha was not simply a diplomat from a faraway world. She was, in fact, Baba Yaga herself, an ancient being with powers far beyond anything the king could comprehend. The moment she had stepped foot into the palace, he had unknowingly unleashed something far more dangerous than any assassination could ever achieve. As Asha's meeting with the king drew closer, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy as he waited for her to arrive. His advisors, who had been carefully watching every move Asha made, had prepared everything for this moment. The plan was set. It was foolproof. Asha would never see it coming. She would be taken down without a trace, her death masking the true motive behind it all: the king's desire to maintain his power. When the doors to the throne room finally opened, the king's eyes narrowed. Asha entered, her posture elegant, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem the least bit worried, even though she had been warned, more than once, that the king wasn't someone to be trusted. She knew what was coming, but she was unshaken. She had a plan of her own. The king couldn't understand it. Was she playing a game, trying to outsmart him, or did she simply not realize how dangerous her position was? Either way, the king felt the surge of anticipation in his chest, ready to bring the game to a swift end. "Welcome, Asha." The king greeted her, his voice calm, but his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. I trust you've had a pleasant stay here in my palace. Asha's eyes met his, her gaze unwavering. I've been treated with respect. As always, she replied, her voice smooth and controlled. But I do not believe you have invited me here for pleasantries. The king's lips curled into a thin smile. She was sharp. He had to give her credit for that. But there was nothing she could do to stop what was already in motion. The guards were positioned, the trap set. The king gestured for her to sit, the moment of their confrontation drawing near. She took her seat without hesitation, as if she were in control of the situation. I'm afraid that what you seek, the king began, his voice carrying a hint of finality, is not something I can grant you. The Federation's terms are unacceptable, and I will not be cowed by your presence or your demands. Asha did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her gaze calculating. The king could feel the weight of her stare, but he refused to show any sign of weakness. He was in control here. He was the one with the power. She would see that soon enough. He leaned forward slightly, as though to emphasize his words. You must leave my palace immediately. If you insist on staying, you will learn that I do not tolerate being challenged. The moment those words left his mouth, something strange happened. A cold draft swept through the room, despite the fact that the windows were sealed shut. The air seemed to shift, heavy with an unspoken tension. For a moment, the king felt a shiver run down his spine, a feeling he had never experienced before. But he quickly dismissed it. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But as Asha's eyes locked onto his once again, something in the room seemed to change. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, stretching unnaturally long. And that was when the king realized he had made a grave mistake. He had thought Asha was just another diplomat, another piece on the political chessboard. But now he understood, too late, that she was far more than that. He had just awakened a force beyond his comprehension. The king's heart raced as he watched Asha, still seated with her unwavering gaze fixed on him. A sense of unease crept up his spine, but he refused to show any sign of vulnerability. He was the ruler of the galaxy, the one who held the power. He had orchestrated the fall of many powerful adversaries, and he would do the same with her. Asha was just another obstacle to be eliminated. The plan was simple, and it would work. He had made the decision long ago. The moment Asha's ship had landed in his system, he knew there could be no negotiation. He couldn't allow the Federation to have any leverage over him. He couldn't allow them to challenge his authority. The king thought of his empire, the millions who relied on his rule, and the legacy he had built. He couldn't let one diplomat destroy it all. You're mistaken if you think you can intimidate me, the king finally said, his voice laced with authority. He had to maintain control, keep his dominance. He wasn't going to let her get the better of him. You should leave while you still have the chance. You're on my turf now, and I won't tolerate anyone who thinks they can come into my palace and dictate terms. Asha remained still, her eyes locked on him, as if she were waiting for something. The king couldn't tell if she was studying him, preparing some kind of counterattack, or simply disinterested in his threats. Either way, she wasn't going to sway him. He could feel the coldness in the air grow more intense, and it unsettled him even further, but he did his best to ignore it. Your terms are unacceptable, Asha said quietly. Her voice didn't waver, and it sent a shiver through the king's body. The way she spoke, so calmly, so confidently, only made his blood boil more. But it is not your power that will decide this outcome. You have underestimated me, king, and that will be your undoing. The king stood up abruptly, unable to take her words any longer. His fists clenched by his sides, his mind racing with thoughts of how to silence her once and for all. He had given the signal to the assassins, his most trusted men, trained in the art of subtlety and speed. They had been placed strategically around the room, hidden in shadows, waiting for his command. The plan was perfect. No one would be able to stop him. But as he moved closer to her, something shifted in the atmosphere, like an invisible force tightening around him. The temperature in the room dropped further, sending a chill through his bones. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, as if they had a life of their own. He couldn't help but notice how the room felt smaller, more suffocating. His pulse quickened, but he pushed the feeling aside. Asha didn't flinch as he approached, nor did she seem afraid. Instead, she stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She was calm, too calm, and it unnerved him more than he was willing to admit. "You think I don't know what you're planning?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper, yet it carried across the room with unnatural clarity. "You believe your assassins will strike when you give the word, but you're wrong. There are things in this universe that no amount of plotting or power can control." The king's face hardened. He would not be intimidated. He had dealt with far worse than threats. "Your federation may be powerful, but you're in my palace now. You are at my mercy, and you will die here if you don't leave immediately." His words hung in the air, thick with finality. But instead of retreating, Asha stepped closer to him. The space between them shrank, and with it, the king could feel the air grow heavier. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe, and for the first time, he felt something. Real fear gnaw at him. Asha stopped mere inches from him, her eyes never leaving his. "You've made the mistake of thinking unlike everyone else," she said softly. "You thought I could be controlled. You thought your position, your power, could intimidate me. But you have no idea who you're dealing with." The king's breath hitched as something seemed to shift in the room. It was as if the very walls were closing in, pushing him toward Asha. He had been in countless dangerous situations, faced countless enemies, but none had ever made him feel like this. His thoughts scattered, his confidence shattered. What was happening? Was this part of her game? He didn't know. He couldn't think. Then it happened. One of the shadows in the room seemed to detach itself, slithering across the floor like liquid darkness. The king's eyes widened in disbelief as the shadow moved toward him, twisting and turning in the air, a dark mass that pulsed with an eerie energy. He felt it brush against his skin, cold and suffocating, as though it were draining the very life from him. "What is this?" he gasped, stepping back, but the shadow followed, its presence growing stronger. Asha's expression remained unchanged as she watched him struggle. "This," she said quietly, "is just the beginning." The king's hands trembled as he reached for his weapon, his most trusted weapon, the one he had always relied on to keep control in situations like this. But as he drew it, his vision blurred and his grip faltered. He couldn't focus. The room spun, and the walls seemed to press in on him from all sides. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance, as he tried to fight against the overwhelming sense of terror creeping over him. Asha moved toward him slowly, a dark smile curling at the edges of her lips. "You thought you could kill me?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet amusement. "You thought your power could defeat me. You thought you could stop Baba Yaga. You were wrong." The king's heart raced as the reality of the situation hit him. He had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated her. No, he had underestimated the very forces she controlled. The power she wielded was ancient, dark, and far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. His mind screamed for him to take action, to regain control, but it was already too late. The shadows were closing in, the air thick with her power, and the king realized with a chilling certainty that his plan, his entire reign, was crumbling in front of him. The king's vision swam as the darkness closed in around him. His mind screamed for him to fight, to regain control of the situation, but the power surrounding him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. His hands trembled as he tried to lift his weapon, but it felt heavier than ever before, as though the weight of his past decisions was now bearing down on him with unrelenting force. His breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows seemed to tighten around his body, constricting, squeezing the air out of his lungs. Asha stood still, her gaze cold and unyielding as she watched the king struggle. There was no fear in her eyes, no mercy. Her calm demeanor only made her power seem more terrifying, more unnatural. The shadows that had once been mere specters of fear now swirled around the king, pulling at him, dragging him further into the depths of his own terror. It was as if the very essence of his being was being stripped away, piece by piece. "You thought you could control me." Ash's voice broke through the suffocating silence. Her words were like daggers, cutting through the king's resolve. "You thought you could end me like you have done to so many others. But there is no control over what you do not understand." The king's heart pounded in his chest, every beat like a thunderclap that echoed in his ears. He stumbled back, his mind scrambling to find any way out. His guards, his trusted assassins, he had given them the signal. But they hadn't moved. They were still. The king's eyes darted around the throne room, desperately searching for some sign of hope, some way to break free. But the shadows were everywhere now, crowding him, suffocating him. There was no escape. "Why?" The king managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this? I never meant for it to go this far." Ash's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained as cold and calculating as ever. "You never meant for it to go this far," she echoed. "You thought your throne was secure, that nothing could touch you. You underestimated me, king. And that was your fatal mistake." The king's knees buckled as he collapsed to the floor, the weight of the shadows pressing down on him like an invisible hand. His mind raced, but it was a blur. He couldn't think. He couldn't breathe. The air itself felt thick, as though it were charged with an energy he could neither comprehend nor fight against. Every part of him screamed for release, for the darkness to lift, but there was no mercy in Ash's eyes, no room for anything but the cold, calculated judgment of the ancient being she was. "You are nothing," Asha said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "Nothing but a small, fragile king who thought he could control the universe with fear. You failed to see the truth, that the galaxy is not yours to rule by force. That power alone cannot protect you from the forces that lie beyond your understanding." The king's chest tightened with dread as her words cut through him like knives. For the first time in his life, he realized how small he truly was. He had built an empire on manipulation and intimidation, but none of that mattered now. He had challenged something much older, much darker than himself, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. Ash's lips curled into a smile, though it was not a smile of warmth. It was a smile of knowing, of understanding. She stepped forward, her movement graceful and fluid, as though she were gliding through the air. The shadows that had once wrapped around the king seemed to recede, but only to reveal something far worse. There was a presence in the room now, an ancient power, a cold, unsettling energy that seemed to seep from every corner of the palace. It was as if the very walls themselves were breathing in sync with her, aligning themselves with her will. "You were right about one thing," Asha continued, her voice now a soft, deadly whisper. "You never meant for it to go this far, but your fate was sealed the moment you tried to destroy what you did not understand." The king struggled to his feet, his body shaking with fear and exertion. He could barely stand, his legs weak beneath him. He tried to steady his breath, tried to focus on anything that could help him escape the nightmarish grip she had on him. But the more he fought, the tighter the shadows seemed to wrap around him. There was no strength left in him, no courage. He had spent so many years building his empire, never imagining that something like this could break him. But now, faced with Asha and the unimaginable power she wielded, he realized how wrong he had been. The king's vision blurred once again, but this time it wasn't just from fear. It was from something else. His body felt cold, distant, as if he were being pulled away from himself. The palace around him seemed to fade, replaced by a swirling mass of darkness and light. He was no longer sure of what was real or what was imagined. He had lost all sense of time and space. Was this the end? Was this how it would all end for him? As if sensing his fear, Asha raised her hand, and the shadows responded, swirling violently around the room. The king let out a strangled gasp as his body froze. His limbs were bound by invisible chains, held captive by her will. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. It was as if the very air itself was choking him, keeping him from breathing, from thinking. "Your reign is over, King," Asha said, her voice carrying across the room like a final verdict. "This is the price of arrogance. This is the cost of underestimating those you cannot see, those you cannot control. You will fall, just like all the others who thought they were invincible." The king's eyes widened in terror as the full weight of his fate crashed down on him. He had thought that he was the one in control, that his power and wealth could shield him from anything. But now, with Asha standing before him, unmoved, unshaken, and all-powerful, he realized that his empire was nothing more than a fragile illusion. With one final wave of her hand, Asha released the king from his invisible bonds. But instead of allowing him to regain his strength, she guided him into a dark, endless void. His screams echoed in the emptiness, but there was no one to hear them. There was no escape from the shadows, no reprieve from the force he had unleashed. And so the Galactic King, once a ruler of vast power, was undone. His fate was sealed by the ancient force he had dared to challenge. The king's world began to unravel in the void. The darkness surrounding him felt like a crushing weight on his soul. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps, but the air around him was thin, suffocating. His mind, once sharp and filled with plans and strategies, now floundered in the face of something it could not understand. The shadows, those same shadows that had once served him in his darkest moments, had now betrayed him, turning against him with terrifying certainty. In that moment, the king realized the true extent of his mistake. He had thought power was everything, that control over others was all he needed to secure his place in the universe. But Asha, this diplomat, this woman he had underestimated, had shown him how fragile that belief truly was. The ancient forces she wielded were beyond his comprehension, beyond anything he had ever encountered. In his arrogance, he had assumed he could strike her down with ease, but now he was the one trapped in the very web he had spun for others. Asha's presence loomed, even though he couldn't see her. Her voice, though soft, rang out clearly in the vast emptiness. "You were so sure of your power, so convinced of your invincibility, but you failed to see what was right in front of you." The king's heart pounded in his chest as her words cut deep, each one a reminder of his own ignorance, his hubris. He had assumed he was in control, that the galaxy bent to his will. Yet here he was, lost in a place where nothing made sense, where he was powerless, his fate hanging on the whim of a woman he thought was nothing more than a pawn. The shadows around him began to shift, coalescing into shapes that were not quite human, not quite real. They moved in slow, deliberate patterns, weaving through the air like ancient spirits, their forms ever-changing, flickering between light and darkness. The king could feel their cold gaze upon him, an invisible weight that pressed down on him from all sides. Asha's voice reached him again, though this time it was colder, sharper. "You thought I was just a diplomat, a mere piece in your game. But you didn't understand who I am. You didn't realize that I am more than just a woman. I am an ancient force, one that you cannot comprehend. I am Baba Yaga." The king recoiled, the name sending a shiver down his spine. Baba Yaga, an entity from the depths of myth and legend, a being that no one, not even the most powerful kings or warriors, dared to cross. He had heard the stories, of course. The ones whispered in hushed tones, the tales of a being who could wield unimaginable power and who had no mercy for those who sought to challenge her. But he had dismissed them. After all, he was a king, a ruler of galaxies. He was above such things. And now, in the depths of this dark void, he understood just how wrong he had been. The shadows swirled faster, becoming more intense, like a storm that raged without end. The king's heart raced in his chest as he tried to escape, tried to break free from the invisible chains that bound him, but there was no escape. He was trapped. The power he had so confidently wielded was now a distant memory, and in its place, There was only fear, a fear so deep and consuming that it seemed to swallow him whole. "You should have stayed in your palace, king." Ash's voice was calm, almost serene, as she spoke from within the darkness. "You should have realized that power without understanding is empty. You never saw me for what I truly am, and that was your undoing." The king's mind spun. He wanted to speak, to beg for mercy, but his mouth was dry, and his tongue felt like lead. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. His empire, his wealth, his armies, they all seemed like nothing now. Nothing in the face of the ancient force that was Asha, the Baba Yaga. "You have no idea what true power is," Asha continued. "It's not about strength or control. It's not about conquering others or bending them to your will. True power is knowing when to let go, when to let the universe do its work. I didn't need to kill you, king. I didn't need to do anything at all. The universe will do that for me." The king's vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw the stars above him, the stars of his empire, the stars that had once been his to command. But they flickered, dimming one by one, as though they were being snuffed out, consumed by the same darkness that surrounded him. "You were never the master of the galaxy," Asha whispered, her voice now a soft echo. "You were never the one in control. You were always a pawn, a tiny speck in the grand design of things. And now your time has come to an end." The king could feel himself slipping, his strength failing, as though he were being pulled into the very depths of the universe. The stars, his empire, his throne, everything was fading away. His mind screamed, but there was no sound. His body felt weightless, as though it were disintegrating, falling apart into nothingness. Asha's presence remained, her voice echoing in his mind. "Remember this, king," she said, her words cold as ice. "Power is fleeting. Control is an illusion. And in the end, even the mightiest of kings will fall." The king's vision darkened completely, the world around him vanishing into the void. He could feel himself being consumed by the very darkness he had tried to command, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him until there was nothing left. And then there was silence. The shadows were gone. The galaxy, once his to command, had faded into nothingness. The king, the ruler of the galaxy, was no more. Only the void remained. The darkness was absolute now. There was no sound, no light, no movement, just an oppressive stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. The king, once so powerful, so certain of his own dominion, was now nothing but a faint memory lost in the void. The stars that had once been his symbols of power were now distant, cold dots in an infinite expanse. The throne he had ruled from, the galaxies he had conquered, were gone. All that remained was the emptiness of space and the echoes of his arrogance. In the distance, a faint shimmer appeared, like a fleeting star rising from the void. It was Asha, standing tall and composed as ever. She was unaffected by the silence, the emptiness, as though she had always been part of this place, this endless expanse of nothingness. The power that had once emanated from her like a tidal wave now settled around her like a calm, dangerous presence. She was no longer just the diplomat he had underestimated. She had always been more than that, far more than anyone could comprehend. Asha looked out over the space where the king had once stood, her eyes narrowing as she silently acknowledged the result of her actions. She had never sought to destroy him for the sake of power or revenge. Instead, it had been a matter of balance. The king had crossed a line, one that should not have been crossed. He had underestimated her, sought to crush her, thinking he was the supreme force in the universe. But now he was gone, his empire reduced to nothing. It was a humbling reminder that no matter how high one may rise, the universe always has a way of righting itself. With a subtle wave of her hand, the remnants of the king's empire, his palaces, his fleet, and all his amassed power, vanished. No trace remained of the man who had once believed he could conquer the galaxy. Asha had restored the balance that had been disturbed by his ambition. His legacy was nothing but dust. Asha turned away from the space where he had once stood, her expression unchanged, her movements graceful and deliberate. As she moved, the void around her shifted, changing in response to her presence. The stars that had been dimming now began to shine more brightly, as though they too had recognized the return of their rightful balance. The galaxy was not hers to rule, and neither was it the king's, nor anyone else's. It belonged to the forces beyond comprehension, to the laws of nature, and to the ancient, unspeakable powers that governed it all. Asha's task had been simple, though it had required her patience and strength. The king had been nothing more than a small, misguided part of a much larger design. And now, with his fall, the galaxy could begin to heal, to return to the natural rhythm that had existed long before his reign and would continue long after his absence. She paused for a moment, sensing the changes happening across the galaxy. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a ripple through the fabric of space that could only be felt by those attuned to the deeper currents of the universe. The people of the galaxy would soon feel the change, but they would not know it had been brought about by a force they could never truly comprehend. Asha, the Baba Yaga, had set things right, and the universe would continue to turn, just as it always had. The king's death would not be mourned. His empire would not be remembered. His name would fade, erased by time, lost to the whispers of those who would never know the truth. The galaxy would carry on, and those who still clung to power and control would soon realize the same lesson the king had learned too late. There is no such thing as true dominion. The universe was far too vast, too ancient, and too powerful to be held in the hands of any one being. Asha's eyes lingered on the expanse before her, where the king had once stood proud, unaware of the forces beyond his reach. She could almost feel the remnants of his ambition fading into the fabric of space, but she felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph. This was simply the way things were meant to be. The galaxy had its cycles, and all things, no matter how powerful or how fleeting, eventually fell into place. She turned, her figure dissolving into the shadows once more, leaving only a faint echo of her presence behind. The universe would continue its path as it always had, and she would remain, watching, waiting, unseen by most, but always present, as the forces of nature moved like tides, unyielding and unstoppable. As the silence returned, the galaxy seemed to breathe again, its systems, its stars, its life continuing on, unaware of the ancient being that had silently altered its course. For those who remained, life would go on. But for the king, and for those who believed they could control fate, the lesson was clear. The universe had no place for arrogance, no place for those who thought they could command it. It was a humbling thought, one that echoed in the void long after the last traces of his empire had faded into nothingness.